So the first thing I wanted to ask was if anybody looked at or read through the year-end processing guide that we mentioned was available. Don or anybody
Early
from your
on,
side?
but probably don't remember enough of it now.
Okay. Yeah, so that year-end processing guide is really going to be key to this year-end process. I don't know anybody who is able to complete the year-end process without following along with that guide. So that guide is you know, it is the key to getting a year-end process done. It walks you through step by step exactly what order to do things in. It tells you all the side reports to run to verify that a step was run correctly. Because really the most important thing to keep in mind about the year-end process is it's on the admin page and all the pieces are here and they're in an order, and the order is critical. You have to go through this list in order, and after each step you want to verify the results of the previous step before moving on to the next step, because if later on you find out there was an issue with an earlier step, you have to go back to that earlier step and redo all the steps from that point onward. So you lose a lot of work if you find a problem with an earlier step much later. So you definitely want to review your results, and in the year-end processing guide, it covers what reports to run to review your results. So it'll say, after you run this step, then run this report and look at the output and make sure that your ADTs look good, and after this step, make sure that your seasonal factors look good, and so on. So that's really something critical that you want to make sure to do after each one of these steps. And so the guide itself is available in the support portal. Don, you already have a copy. When you start a new year-end process every year, you're going to want to go check to see if there's a new version of it, because we tend to make slight changes or enhancements, add extra steps, add extra clarifications to that guide. So you can always go into the support portal, and I have to log in as somebody else here to gain access to it. Otherwise, it'll go into my agent desktop. But if I click the support portal, there's processing annual statistics HPMS section here in the knowledge base. And so there's a guide on exporting TMAS, but then there's also this year-end processing guide. So you can check the year-end processing guide, and it should have a date on it and a last updated date listed here. So this was last updated in October. So if the version that you have is from earlier than that, you're going to want to download a fresh copy of this year-end processing guide. So for year-end processing, you basically take these steps one by one and go through them. The first thing that you're going to be doing is computing seasonal factors. So you've got all your permanent count stations, they've collected data all year, and now you want to create a set of seasonal factors and then use those seasonal factors to compute ADTs at your short count stations. So this first step says calculate permanent count station ADTs. We come in here, you choose a year to compute ADTs for. You choose your start date and end date. There's some flexibility here because we had a couple of clients who wanted to compute partial year ADTs for the perm stations. And so we gave them some flexibility on how they compute their ADTs at the perm stations. But you just click this button and it'll run and it'll fill in ADTs for all of your perm stations. Once you've got your ADTs on your perm stations, you could review those. You can run reports in the main system, come back to the main system and do a search, maybe an advanced search for your perm stations, and then go into Report Center and run a report that maybe compares this year's ADT versus last year's ADT. And you can look at any of the ones that had a very large discrepancy. So in the year-end processing guide, it tells you what report to run there to do a year-over-year ADT comparison in Report Center. And then after that, if you find any outliers or any perm stations that have issues, you could go find the counts that were causing the ADT to be wrong on a certain station and reject more of the data. So rejected counts don't get used in an ADT calculation, and if you've got bad counts on a certain station, you just go reject a bunch of counts, and then you can come in here and redo your permanent count station ADTs. So you kind of redo the step, get your correct ADTs, and then rerun the reports, and if everything looks good, then you move on to the next step. So the next step here is seasonal factor clustering. So we've got this clustering interface that, is it going to let me do this? It does, okay. So the warning box that came up at the beginning there said that all years are currently locked. We have your AADT backdate set to only allow processing on 2020 forward. So anything that's 2019 or before is locked and can't be modified. So that's what that warning was telling me. I can't actually process this because it's in an older year that's been locked. And if you ever need to change that lock, you can do so on the admin page. If you scroll down to system settings, there's this thing called AADT backdate. It's set to 2020 right now. So anything before 2020 cannot be changed. All of the statistics and all of the seasonal factors and all of that stuff can't be changed for years prior to 2020 right now. You get the green checkbox and you can change that year temporarily. So if you do find that you need to make a change to something in 2019, you could set it to 2019, go make your change, then come back in here and change it back to 2020 to relock it. So in the clustering interface, you've got your different groups in this factor group dropdown here. So each one of these groups has a check mark next to it. That means that group has been processed. It has factors now. So it's kind of a way to step through each of the groups. When you start on a new year, they'll all start out unchecked, and this bar at the top will say 0 of 205, 0% complete. So you have none of the seasonal factors processed yet. And if you click on a group, it shows you the graph of that station or the stations. If there were multiple stations in the group, it would show multiple lines, and you can see their seasonal pattern. Now, for a seasonal factor group to be valid, you want all of the stations in that group to exhibit a similar pattern. It looks like your current groups as they're set up are individual stations, where each one is just a single station. The recommendation from FHWA is to have groups with at least 5 stations in them, usually around 10 stations per group, to cover months of data that might be missing on certain stations, or to even out any fluctuations at a given station, kind of come up with an average for a certain group, things like that. And so this interface works better for groups that are actually with multiple grouped stations, because you can use these tools here to remove outliers. So if you've got a group that's got 10 stations in it, you'll see 10 lines on here, and a couple of the lines might not follow the pattern of that group. And you can then use that information to either maybe assign that station to a different group, because maybe it doesn't belong in that group. Maybe the pattern is more related to a different group and it should belong to a different group. So then you could go reassign it to a different group. Or maybe it was just a 1-year fluctuation. Maybe there was issues at that count station this year, and you just want to exclude it from this group for this 1 year. You can click on the line and it will either include or exclude it from the group. So each line will have its own color. They'll be color coded over here. And if something is gray, that means it's being excluded. And so you would gray out the lines that kind of don't fit the pattern. And there is some automatic outlier removal where it can check for 3.5 standard deviations from the average and exclude those automatically to help you process these. So once you've picked which stations you want to be in your group and which ones to exclude, you would click the process button, and it's going to take those stations and compute seasonal factors for them, and then display a page to you that shows those seasonal factors. And you can manually adjust them if you want to at that point. So if you see something that looks wrong, or you want to just slightly modify something, you can make some tweaks to it. But then you confirm it, and that gets saved as your seasonal factor for that group. That group then gets a check mark next to it, and this bar moves up a little bit, and you keep moving down the list of stations to process them all. Now, if you want to keep single station groups like you have, and you've got 205 groups, and you don't want to use this clustering interface on all 205 groups, instead you can use this process all button. The process all button is a bulk processor that just uses all the stations as is without any picking and choosing of stations to belong into a group. So it's just going to blanket use all the data for all the groups and create seasonal factors from those. And then you could review the seasonal factors afterwards to find if there were any groups that had issues or things like that. So we do allow some tools to make processing a large number of groups easier if that's the way that you want to go. Any questions about the clustering interface or seasonal factors?
If you had a large number of groups and you went through and you did a couple factor groups individually and made changes and then hit the process all, or would you do process all and then go and review?
I think what you would want to do is do process all first. I think process all does them all no matter what. So you do process all first, and then if you wanted to do some single ones, you can pick that group and then say unprocess, and then do it manually with this interface. So the unprocess allows you to reprocess an individual group. Any other questions? Okay. So then after you've computed your seasonal factors, you can review them in the Manage Lists area here, seasonal factors. You could click View Lists and take a look at your groups and the years and click on View for a particular year for that group. And you can see the factors here. You can hit the 12x7 grid editor to view the factors in a grid. So you can see here all the factors, and you can export them out to Excel. This is a visual way to take a look at your factors after you've computed them. And then the year-end processing guide mentions a report center report that you can run that outputs your seasonal factors into a report so that you can review the seasonal factors in a report kind of all at once. With 200, I don't know, that report's going to be pretty long. Most agencies only have about 10 seasonal factor groups. So that's a little bit more reasonable to output as a report. But there is a report center report that can help you review your seasonal factors to make sure that they look good. After you're done with seasonal factoring, you would move on to axle factoring. So this is going to take all of your class counts, and again, there's a clustering interface for this. So you look at your groups. In this case, you've got 489 groups. This is more common on the axle factoring. A lot of people do site-to-site, single-site assignments for axle factoring. We do have some clients who do larger groups and then kind of get an average across the groups. But a high number of axle factor groups is more common among DOTs. And again, we have a process all to help you process those groups. But it's a very similar interface here, but in this case, we're seeing the pattern of the different 13 classes and how high those ones are. And on this, when you hit process, it will give you the option of computing the factors by month, day of week, by month, or by year. And so if you have a permanent count station that's got class data, you can do month, day of week and get, very fine-grained axle factors that says on January, Wednesday, this is my axle factor. But if you don't have very complete data or you don't trust that perm station as much, you might go with monthly factors. So then you would just get a single factor for each month of the year. Or if it's a short count station and you've only done maybe one short count, class count at that station, you would want to process it by year in that case, so that you get just a single axle factor for the entire year. So there are some options there as to the fidelity of your axle factors.
Can you change the scale of that graph, or it's fixed? Or
not really, because there's this really high point here. It's kind of maxing out because of class 2 being so large. We can look at it. So there's a few options here. You can look at the volume instead. So this changes the scale to be volume of vehicles. We can look at the factor, or we can look at the z-score. The z-score doesn't work in this case. What is the z-score? I think the z-score only works if there are multiple stations in a group. So I think the z-score is the standard deviation from the average. So you'd need multiple stations in the group to have, so your outliers would stand out more if you look at the z-scores. But those are the only options that we have currently.
okay. Okay.
What did all those negative ones mean when you're in the seasonal factor cluster?
Oh, yeah, when I was viewing the seasonal factors, so -1 means that there's no value. So we were not these are all historic factors that we populated, and we were told that you don't have weekend factors, so we don't know what the Sunday and Saturday factors are. So what that means is if a short count is collected on a Sunday, we would not be able to compute an AADT from it. So if it sees a -1, it won't compute an AADT using that Sunday count. And some people do that on purpose because they don't want to use weekend data to compute a seasonal factor. But some people do use weekend data because if you've got a valid seasonal factor for Sundays, then it should be able to create an accurate AADT anyway. It just depends on whether your data contains the weekend factors or not. So after axle factoring is complete, you would want to run some reports on that and verify your axle factors. You can view them in the list up here or on a report in Report Center. The next step is to back process AADTs. So throughout the year, most agencies will compute preliminary AADTs on all of their short count stations. They'll use the previous year's factors to compute an AADT for counts that were taken in the current year. So all the stations will have these preliminary AADTs, but now that we've gotten through these first few steps, we have an accurate seasonal factor for the year that we're processing. We have an accurate axle factor. We can reprocess all of those short count AADTs to get accurate AADTs, to get your final AADTs on those short count stations. And so what this back process AADTs does is it goes and it wipes out all those preliminary AADTs and recomputes new ones overnight. So AADT calculation generally happens overnight. So this back process step will wipe out the current AADTs, and then that signifies to our system overnight, hey, I need to compute new AADTs because I see short counts here that have valid factors, and I can compute the AADTs for those. So the next day you would come in and you would have your finalized AADTs on all of your short count stations. And at this step, you're definitely going to want to take a very close look at all of your AADTs, both short and perm, across the entire agency, and do some checks there, because if there's any count data that you want to invalidate, or bad counts being used, or count data that got missed and needs to get re-uploaded, you definitely want to do it here before you move on to these later steps, because then you'll have to come back and recompute these AADTs and then redo all these steps after that again. So after this step, it's very critical to review those AADTs. After this, we've got an optional step. We can create two-way AADTs from directional AADTs. So for various reasons, you might end up with a missing two-way AADT, but have a directional AADT, maybe in one direction or even in both directions. If you've got one in both directions, you can add it up into the two-way AADT, even though you didn't have a raw count that was two-way. Maybe they're collected on different days. That's why you didn't have a raw count on the two-way. Or if you have a single direction AADT, you could double the single direction AADT to get the two-way AADT. So this is an optional step to fill in some extra AADTs. Once you've got all those filled out, then the next step is to go into growth factor clustering. So because you have all of your ADTs now, you can try to compute your growth factors for your groups. This is definitely something I've never seen, somebody having individual stations for growth factoring. Those are usually a composite growth factor for regions. I've never seen anybody do more than 5 or 10 growth groups at the most. Because these you definitely want, wow, these are groups. Okay. They just have varying numbers of stations. Yeah, some of these have a lot of stations in them. But 204 groups, that's a lot. So what this does is it shows you the ADTs for the last few years, and then this is the growth factor. You could look at the straight volumes if you want. You can see here, you know, this is one station that's just growing a little bit. This station is kind of flat line, and you can look at all these different ones here.
BJ,
yeah.
You and I may need to specifically talk about this later offline, but it looks like it's showing, you know, like 01013 is the permanent station that all these sites are supposed to be getting their growth factors for. So maybe
Okay.
we
So
have this set up in the incorrect way.
Well, it might just be a way that we're doing things differently than you had done them for growth factoring. This is definitely, we should definitely have a conversation about it. The way that we do it is any station that has year-over-year data, if it's got an ADT based on real raw counts in 1 year and the next year, we can compute a growth factor from it. So we use that station regardless of whether it's a perm station or not. So if you have short count stations that you count year after year after year, if they're annual stations, then we will use those ADTs as part of the growth factor calculation. So if these stations don't have actual ADTs year over year, they shouldn't be showing up here. That might be a bug, potentially. But
It's just using the statistical ADT maybe, rather than...
Right. I'm thinking what's happening here is what we're seeing is legacy data. So because legacy counts come in as code 1, they come in as authoritative ADTs because they were in your historic system that way. That's why we've got these in here. Whereas in our system, if a station wasn't counted in a given year, it would be tagged with a code 3, meaning it was grown. And even though it's got a statistical ADT, it's not a real ADT, and it wouldn't be used in the factoring interface. So this will probably look different when we look at 2020. So we can definitely talk about that some more. But again, This is just another clustering interface, and it functions basically the same. So you try to compute your growth factors with this step. After you've got your growth factors, you can review them in the growth factor list or in a growth factor report. And then your next step is to calculate missing ADTs from growth factors. This is where I was mentioning that, you know, those stations where you didn't do a count in that year, now we can fill in a missing ADT and tag it with a number 3 code that says this ADT was grown from the previous year using growth factors. And so we fill in those missing ADTs there. Then
now, by the time that happens, the time that's happened, the numbers that have progressed to that point, they've already been seasonally adjusted. So anything that's of the right year is already annualized by season. So that's why we did them in this order. Okay.
Yep. So the next step, if you're using ramp or corridor balancing, you would do that now. There's a different section of the system, and that would be a whole other talk to get into ramp corridor balancing, but you would do that at this point now. It's listed here just as a reminder to go do that if that was something that you're doing in the system. that's going to further adjust your ADTs. So we've got ADTs on all your stations, you do your balancing, and that might change some of your ADTs and kind of get you to your new adjusted final ADTs on all of your ramps and corridors. Then the next step is to calculate HPMS stats for all of your stations that had raw counts in that year. So you're going to generate your K factors and your D factors, your truck ADTs, single and combo. If you have real class data, a 13 class count at a given station, we're going to compute classified ADTs for that station. So we get an individual class ADT for all 13 classes, and that's going to be used in some of the later steps. So this is a very critical step. It uses your real data from the year that you're processing. So for 2020, anything that had a real count in it, we compute all of these statistics and put them into our stat table. The next step is kind of just to prepare for the following year. By this point, usually you've double and triple checked all of your seasonal and axle factors, and you can copy those factors to the following year so that those preliminary ADTs that we talked about previously can get computed. So, you know, you've got your factors, they're finalized, they've been reviewed multiple times, you know they're correct, and you copy them to the following year so that those preliminary ADTs can get computed in 2021, for example. The next step is sort of an optional step. I forget which DOT asked us to add this one. And in the year-end processing guide, it calls out that which steps are optional. There's several of them in here that are optional. This is one of them. They have one of our DOTs has partial manual class counts, and they wanted to multiply it by 1.17 for some reason and use that to calculate class ADTs. So they've got some special routine that they use. And the year-end processing guide goes into more detail of how it works, so you could decide if you collect data that's very similar to the way that they collected data, you could potentially use this step if you wanted to for that type of count data. I think it's 13 class data that was collected with count boards, which you guys do as well. So you might want to read this section. Maybe this applies to you. The next step is to calculate seasonal class factors. So not a lot of DOTs do this because you need really good data. You need a lot of permanent count station data that's classified. And the DOTs who do it only have a single class, which I think Don suggested that you guys could do one group of this. So a statewide group was added. And so in this step, it's kind of a two-step process. We don't have a clustering interface for this yet because the data is so dense. It's like a 4-dimensional grid of data, and we can't figure out a good UI for a clustering interface for this yet. But we are kind of mulling a way to do that eventually. But for right now, it's just a simple process. You select the year to process, and then you can compute class seasonal factors. What it's going to do is take all the permanent stations that have class data in that group and come up with seasonal class factors, which is seasonal factors for each individual class. So you've got month, day of week factors for your motorcycles, month, day of week factors for your class 9 trucks. You've got month, day of week factors for each of the 13 classes. And then the next step after you compute your factors and you've reviewed them is to compute the modified AADTs that are for each of the 13 classes. So any of your stations that have 13 class data then, short counts. So we're using, you know, the factors from the perm stations to modify the 13 class counts on the short stations to seasonally adjust those ADTs by class. So it's a step further, more granular than doing just seasonal adjustments across the board. It's doing each of the 13 classes individually. So that step would update those ADTs. Next is class distribution factor clustering. So this is a very important step where you take, and yeah, we probably don't have class ADTs, so this one won't show anything on the graph currently. You need those class ADTs from all the previous steps in this step to come up with these class distribution factors. So what this is if you've got a group with a station or multiple stations in it that have class data, you can process the factors for that group and come up with percentages for each of the individual 13 classes and say, well, my class 9s are 12% and my class 10s are 2% and things like that. So for that given group, then you have a set of factors that say, this is the general distribution of the 13 classes. Once you've got a good set of class distribution factors, which again, you can review up in the managed lists, we can also create some extra class ADTs from length counts. So this is a different way to get class ADTs. You enter the number of feet that is a divider between single and combo trucks, and it tries to parse your length-based data that has numerical lengths on it into single and combo truck numbers. So that's filling in some potential class ADTs there. And then anything else at this point now that didn't have a class ADT for whatever reason, maybe it was a volume-only station or it had no good class data, it doesn't have any class ADTs, apply class distribution factors, goes and estimates class ADTs on all of those stations that don't have a class ADT. So after this step, every single station in the entire system is going, that belongs to a class distribution factor group, is going to have 13 class ADTs. So that is really the goal of class distribution, is to get estimated truck numbers on every station in the system. And so after you do that step, you're going to want to definitely review all of your truck numbers across all of your stations and see that those look good. The next couple of steps are some math routines that happen to fill in some more numbers. So percent peak single and percent peak combo trucks, that'll get computed automatically on stations that had class data, but for volume count stations, you don't have a real value for that. So what we do is we set it to the average of that location's class distribution group stations. So all of the class counts in that class distribution group will come up with a average percent peak single and combo and assign that to all the volume count stations. Then there's a step here to clean up and proportionally adjust the 13 class ADTs to make sure that they still sum up to the ADT. So due to rounding errors and things like that, the ADT might be off by a couple of vehicles. So we will readjust the 13 class ADTs to make sure that they perfectly sum up to that official ADT, and so that all the math works out correctly. And then compute combined truck stats from the individual classes. So far we've got 13 class ADTs. We need to come up with single and combo truck numbers, and then our PA and BC numbers, which are car and business commercial numbers. So this step will fill in those stats. And then at that point now, you've got all of your your truck stats are all done for all of your stations, and you can definitely give them a close review again. The next few steps are for WIM stations. They deal with e-cells and things like that. So some states don't do these steps, some states do, but you can do a per vehicle flex and rigid e-cell. So it goes out and it computes the e-cell for each individual vehicle on all of your WIM sites. That one takes a while to compute. Usually it runs overnight. It might take a full day to compute. Then using those values, we can compute E-cell factors for your WIM stations. So if you've got multiple WIM stations in a group, we can come up with an averaged E-cell factor for each of the 13 classes for a particular group. And then we can do another type of distribution here where you can estimate E-cells on all of your non-WIM stations. So any station that doesn't have WIM data, you use the E-cell factors for each of the 13 classes, and you estimate a flex and rigid E-cell for each of the non-WIM stations. And then we can compute an annual flex rigid E-cell stat to put into the stat table. And then at that point, you would have flex and rigid E-cells on all of your stations. Then there's one final catch-all step here where you can pull stats forward from the previous year. So if for some reason a station didn't belong to class distribution groups, or it didn't belong to E-cell group, or you didn't like the stats for a station and you blanked it out, you could pull stats forward from the prior year. So the goal after this step is to make sure that every single station has every single stat. That is the ultimate goal of TCDS year-end processing. So in TCDS, for all the traffic count stations, you want every single station to have every single possible stat. And then that data is going to get transferred over to the HPMS module, where you put that information onto segments. So the HPMS module deals with the segments, and we grab all of the stats that were just finished in TCDS and bring them over to those segments. So that is the ultimate goal here. After that, you definitely want to do some in-depth checks on everything and make sure that all your stats look good. And you could run various reports in Report Center that report on HPMS stats. There's the metadata report and things like that in Report Center. But that's all covered in the year-end processing guide. So that was a fairly fast run through all of this stuff. When you actually do it yourself, you're going to want to follow that guide. You're going to be reaching out to me. The first year or two that DOTs do these steps, they definitely work closely with me. They send me emails, sometimes daily, asking me questions, having me check things. That's totally fine. That's expected. And but after you've done it a couple of years, it definitely gets easier and it becomes second nature, and you just kind of zip through these steps. Ben has done a lot of these for some of our clients that are paying us to do their year-end processing for them. Ben can do it in about 2 days now. Most clients, it usually takes them the first time probably about a month to go through this, because there's a lot of checking and rechecking and maybe redoing of certain steps. But usually you can complete this in, after you get good at it, within a week. If anybody's got any questions about any of it at all, open it up to anything.
BJ, this is Sarah. You mentioned at the end is when you kind of pull everything over and put it on the segments. I think we've had some internal conversations about how do we make sure all of our segments are covered, and when do we need to kind of load our segment network to make that happen. So I think we had in our minds like we would need to load it early so we can make sure we have it covered, and then we'd load a final network later to make sure it matches with reality. Does that kind of comment / question make sense? And what would you recommend?
We usually ask that clients send us one network during an HPMS season. It's their final road network. We don't want the network changing. There's a lot of effort that happens on our end to process a road network each year for a client. So I'm not sure why you would want to do 2 different networks. Is there a reason for that?
Maybe Jennifer will be able to say.
Yeah. So, and with the understanding that this is how we've always done things, but when we go out and collect information from the local agencies on their networks and their data, it's for the year 2020. So they're not submitting it to us yet. So we're making changes to the network between January and April to catch up to last year. So
yeah, and that's fine. because during that time period, TCDS stats are still being finalized, and all of these steps that I just walked through are still being run. That stuff doesn't need to transfer over to the network until April. So you could give us that final network in April, and then then have us transfer the stats over, and it'll be ready to do all at once.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. This whole process is purely TCDS, so does it really matter? I could sit there for 2 months before the network's loaded.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I think internally we might want to have a discussion about trying it early. If only because if this process can be done and they can generate ADTs earlier in the year, then maybe we can take the network that we come up with at January 1st, because we do a complete network then. It's going to be a lot closer to the last HPMS submittal. But we might be able to use that network instead, and then just kind of keep an eye on the changes that we make to the network. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we had that agenda to talk about the network files. So that covers it, Sarah? Okay.
Yep, from my perspective at least, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I don't have any other questions. Mine are mostly going to be for Don and Ali, and what are they going to do with all those new possibilities that the system's going to provide them.
I think we're going to swim is what we're going to do. Yeah.
It's going to be hard to give up that big, huge Excel spreadsheet and doing everything by hand, isn't it?
I love Excel.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can wrap up. Thank you, BJ. And thanks everyone for attending.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much for doing it.